Carroll O'Connor had a huge presence both on and off screen as the face of one of the most recognizable television programs. However, beneath the notoriety and the remarkable performance was a resentment he would never be able to let go of. Nor merely an argument, nor merely a personality conflict. This was something more profound, something intimate. Fans were unaware that it was even taking place for decades. He never again mentioned the name in public. And the hush that followed the last curtain's fall spoke it all. What actually occurred then, and who was it that Carroll O'Connor never showed forgiveness to, you will be rendered dumbfounded by the response. "You're a meathead. Dead from the neck up, meathead. Meathead." And unrepentantly set in his ways, yet incredibly human in some manner. Archie's ideal counterpoint was a younger, witty figure on the other side of him. Their back-and-forth interplay was electrifying, not simply humorous. The audience was captivated by their arguments, conflicts, and sudden moments of intimacy. It was amazing on the screen. However, many were unaware at the time of how much the tension developing behind the scenes was reflected in their roles. They seemed to get along well in public. They complimented one another in interviews and joked at press conferences. However, a number of crew members claimed that there was a slight unease between them from the beginning. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a dramatic moment. However, it was present. According to some, it all began during rehearsals when artistic choices started to irritate both men. Some claim it was personal from the start. Under public scrutiny, two people who were raised in quite different worlds attempt to collaborate. One was an accomplished actor with decades of experience and classical training. The other, who was just starting out in his profession, added fresh vitality to the program along with a sharp tongue and strong ideas. The two stars' differences only became more apparent as the show gained popularity and became into a cultural phenomenon. They all had different approaches, various objectives, and different ideas about what the family should be in the end. Even though they were both able to maintain a professional demeanor, the subtle tension persisted for a long. Slowly and quietly, what began as creative friction would evolve into something far more intimate. The family appeared to be a well-oiled machine from the outside. It produced headlines, laughter, and ratings that broke records week after week. Despite their skill on screen, the two leading men rarely agreed, and behind the laughing was a set full of strong opinions and great expectations. Carroll O'Connor has a reputation for being meticulous, almost compulsive. He valued significant storyline, nuanced character development, and precise timing. Every syllable was important. Every pause had a reason. He did not merely commit scripts to memory. He improved them, modified them, and examined them. Although he was regarded by writers, they also understood that he was not hesitant to voice their disagreements. Then there was his younger co-star, who was vivacious and witty, and who added a distinct personality to the scene. He was more at ease, more responsive, and undoubtedly more outspoken about the course he believed the show should go. Carroll wanted to maintain the series' character-driven foundation, but his co-star was becoming more interested in exploiting the show as a platform. He had plans to say anything more. Many of them. However, Carroll's sense of what the show should be occasionally ran counter to those concepts. According to one crew member's recollection, Carroll requested that a sequence that seemed overly general or didactic be rewritten. His co-star, however, demanded that everything stay exactly as written. It was a firm disagreement, yet it was not noisy. Additionally, some viewers noticed that the final edit went more toward the tone of the younger actor than Carroll's when the show aired. Carroll saw a trend even if it was subtle. Those on the set said it began modestly. Casual remarks made at table readings, arguments over a phrase or a joke, but it got out of hand. At times, Carroll thought his co-star was disrespecting the show's core, or worse, making it into something it wasn't supposed to be. He never gave names, but at one point he even threatened to leave the show because he was so unhappy with the way episodes were being handled. Many, however, thought they knew who he was referring about. While trying to diffuse the tension, other cast members like Sally Struthers and Gene Stapleton were frequently caught in the midst. However, they were not always able to bridge the gap. Carroll gave each scene his full emotional commitment. Additionally, it disrupted his rhythm when his co-star improvised or played it too loosely during live tapings. That wasn't just distracting to Carroll, who intentionally constructed each rhythm, it was disruptive. Nevertheless, neither man ever allowed the fissures to be shown on television. Their timing was impeccable throughout their performances. Some sequences were shot right after tense arguments, yet viewers would never have realized that. However, there was tension, increasing with every season. Become more circumspect. His co-star started speaking up more. The relationship had obviously changed, even if they never had a full-blown falling out, at least not in public. However, what followed would cause stress to give way to something even more difficult to resolve. Carroll O'Connor and his co-star had a simmering conflict for years that never quite boiled over but never quite subsided. Then followed what many consider to be the turning point in history. It was subdued, there was no big altercation or slamming of doors, just a few public remarks that made a lasting impression. Carroll's co-star was questioned about the influence of the show and the significance of their characters in an interview. The response appeared normal at first, but then it changed. He started to separate himself from Carroll and, thus, from the persona of Archie Bunker. He characterized Archie as dangerous in addition to flawed. A remnant of a way of thinking that, in his opinion, is never worthy of admiration or empathy. Carroll saw it as a slap in the face, even though it didn't sound like much. He took it personally, according to those close to him. Personally, Carroll saw Archie as a meticulously constructed portrayal, while the audience saw him as a fictional figure. Layered. Intentional. Human. He never thought of the figure as a villain, but he also never thought of him as a hero. Instead of being a monster, Archie Bunker was supposed to be a mirror. And it felt like more than just criticism to hear his co-star character characterize him in such a negative light. It was like being betrayed. To make matters worse, newspapers and television stations across carried the comments. A simmering dispute was alluded to in headlines. Carroll was silently furious but never retaliated in public. He felt ambushed, according to friends. Particularly considering that the co-star had developed his career with Carroll, capitalizing on Archie's dynamism and nuance. Everything they had created together seemed to be erased. Even worse, Carroll thought those remarks made it difficult to distinguish between the actor and the character. Silent but persistent rumors began to circulate that Carroll shared Archie's more controversial opinions. He repeatedly denied it, of course. However, the harm had already been done. Long after the series concluded, Carroll carried that silent difference between the two men with him, and it turned into something colder. Carroll claimed in private talks with close friends that he understood Archie's motivations. He shaped him, and now he behaves as though it were poison. He carried that feeling of betrayal and being left to defend the persona by himself for years. Carroll never mentioned the incident directly, not even when questioned about it afterward. But once the subject approached, his tone changed. The shift was noticed by friends. Quit bringing up his co-star in interviews. He became notably silent during retrospectives and reunions. He used to give credit to writers, producers, and even guest actors, but no longer to him. They were both famous thanks to the show. However, Carroll saw the cost as a broken relationship that would never completely mend. The quiet between them only got louder when the cameras stopped rolling. An era came to an end when All in the Family eventually concluded. For years, millions of people watched the Bunkers, growing, laughing, and debating with them. However, Carroll O'Connor and his co-star took two rather different paths in their personal and professional lives once the lights went out and the soundstage became empty. Carroll's attachment to Archie Bunker remained strong. He remained dedicated even after the show switched to Archie Bunker. Even though the world was changing, he still thought that stories should be told with an unvarnished, painful honesty. He was pursuing impact rather than celebrity. And the shadow of Archie never really left him, even if he played various parts later. In life, most notably in the Heat of the Night. It was a quality that, for better or worse, characterized him. His former co-star, meanwhile, appeared to change course almost immediately. He left acting to pursue directing full-time, not just side gigs. He soon rose to prominence as one of his generation's most renowned filmmakers. He was responsible for huge hits and received widespread praise for his behind-the-camera work. Despite this, Carroll's name was hardly ever brought up in any of the documentaries, retrospectives, or interviews regarding his burgeoning career. It was observed that the man who had previously stood next to him in numerous scenes was largely absent from the narrative. It also hurt. Carroll would lovingly praise Gene Stapleton, Norman Lear, and other individuals who contributed to the show's legacy when the entire family was honored or mentioned at award events. However, he never mentioned the name of his co-star. Not once. It was more than a simple omission. It seemed deliberate. Additionally, Carroll would graciously reroute the discussion when reporters asked. He never made fun of others. He never struck out. However, the message was unambiguous. There was no warmth, no shared memories, no reconciliation. The show's insiders started talking more candidly about the conflict. Some referred to it as pride. Others claimed that there was a basic conflict of ideals. However, Carroll's closest friends and family thought it was something more profound, a feeling of being abandoned, of helping someone get to the top only to be forgotten once they did. And as the years went by, the story emerged from the silence. After sharing the limelight and contributing to the creation of one of the most influential television programs ever, two men now lived as strangers. Carroll, however, would not remain silent indefinitely. When the time was perfect, he finally told it like it was. And they were startled by what he said. Years went by. The world changed. Television changed over time. The audiences shifted. And pop became a part of the family's heritage. History of culture. Carroll O'Connor, however, never fully recovered from some of his wounds. He hardly ever discussed the past until someone specifically asked him to, and even then, he was careful with his wording. When he did think back on those years, however, the lack of a single name was overwhelming. In the 1990s, Carroll was asked if he missed working with his previous cast in a televised interview. Just enough for onlookers to see, his face moved. He answered, yes, with a soft smile, then paused when asked directly about the on-screen son-in-law who had been in so many of his appearances. He thought the youngster did a terrific job. That was it. Just the boy, no warmth, no name. It might have sounded like a strange word choice to the majority of spectators, but to those who knew Carroll, it said a lot. He was not a name-forgetful man. He was exact, methodical, and purposeful when he didn't identify someone. It was his way of conveying that he had run out of things to say. In private, acquaintances claimed that Carroll still felt deceived not by anything scandalous or illegal, but by something far more intimate. He thought that his co-star had used the entire family as a stepping stone in order to eventually undermine the main character and, hence, the show's heart. He felt lost. As if the years they invested in creating one of the most potent teams on television had been forgotten. Carroll never broke, even when appearing on late-night chat shows and at business gatherings. He would change the subject and give a courteous nod if the name was mentioned. There's nothing to be said that I haven't already decided not to say, he once quipped to a co-worker off camera. It wasn't resentment. It was a line that he never went over. Later, a number of his co-workers verified what many had suspected. What Carroll perceived as a rewrite of their common history was something he never fully forgiven. The acknowledgement had disappeared along with the respect. It has nothing to do with ego. It has to do with legacy. Carroll had put his heart and soul into the message, the character, and the show. And it was more painful than most fans knew to witness someone dismiss that while downplaying the part he played. For Carroll, it went beyond disagreements over creativity or work. It was about gratitude, devotion, and the realization that he had been abandoned at the end of the day. But he never snapped, not even in his last interviews. The whole tale was never told by him. He let the quiet do the talking. And that silence lasted forever until the end eventually arrived. The last years of Carroll O'Connor were characterized by dignity, fortitude, and introspection. He had suffered from health issues that gradually diminished his public demeanor, as well as personal tragedy, including the untimely death of his son. But for those who had grown up watching him, he continued to be a figure of strength. And accolades from all around the entertainment industry flooded in when word of his dying leaked out in June 2001. Producers, directors, and actors waited in line to share their recollections. The man who had given Archie Bunker so much depth was honored by Norman Lear, Gene Stapleton, and innumerable others. However, one voice was conspicuously missing. The most famous co-star of Carroll had said nothing. Days went by. Weeks later. Not an homage. Nothing to say. No appearance in public at the funeral. It was impossible to ignore the stillness for fans expecting for a final display of respect. Some thought the decision was a private one, a silent expression of grief. Others had a different perspective. It was the last evidence to them that the division between these two men had never been reconciled. In death, in life, and even in legacy, no. Close relatives, old acquaintances, and a number of television celebrities attended the funeral, which was a small but emotional gathering. Carroll was praised for his professionalism, friendliness, and passionate commitment by almost everyone who had worked with him. However, many people were unable to ignore the vacant chair where his former co-star might have been sitting while the service went on. Some anticipated a surprise visit, a farewell embrace of the past, but it never materialized. Years later, documentaries about every member of the family started to appear. These retrospectives examined the show's cultural significance, the cast's camaraderie, and the storytelling's audacity. Carroll's name was honored, and his impact recognized. His former co-star remained distant once more. Almost every program had no in-depth commentary from the man who had earlier supported Carroll, despite others praising his dedication, brilliance, and generosity. Carroll's former co-star never mentioned Carroll by name in subsequent interviews when asked about All in the Family, and the tribute that fans had hoped for was never given. It wasn't upset. It wasn't sour. It was simply deserted. That emotional detachment made an impact. It seemed as though those years spent together had been discreetly sealed off and were no longer included in the story he wished to tell. Fans took note. Question-filled comment sections. Why was there no sound? Why is it so cold? And many thought the reality was straightforward, even though no clear solution was ever provided. Carroll O'Connor and his co-star have never been able to work out their differences. It wasn't a dramatic outburst or a feud in the tabloids. There was something more profound, a basic fracture that neither man could bring himself to mend. Carroll, according to some, waited for an apology that never materialized. Some others think he accepted the stillness. However, one thing is for sure. When it came time to say farewell, there was only the soft reverberation of a friendship that had long since waned, no reunion, no emotional message. That silence, in a sense, spoke louder than words ever could. One of the most recognizable personalities in television history was created by Carroll O'Connor. There was more to Archie Bunker than a position. He served as a lightning rod, a window into the times, and a conduit for Carroll's candor, openness, and scathing humor. Whether they wanted to or not, millions of people saw themselves reflected in him, laughed with him, and debated him. However, Carroll was more than just Archie's guy. He was a proud parent, a highly contemplative artist, and a man who placed the highest importance on loyalty. That is the reason the breakup with his co-star hurt so much. Not only for him, but also for everybody who appreciated their magic on screen. It had never been phony. They had a genuine chemistry. Their timing was perfect. They made something that could not be practiced come to life. And that's why the subsequent stillness seems so startling. There was only absence, no scandal, no explosive interviews, no dramatic feud that made headlines. After sharing a platform, history, and greatness, two men never mentioned each other again. Not affectionately, not kindly, and not at all. And perhaps that's what adds to the tragedy. Because the family's narrative was about more than just a family. It was about individuals attempting to communicate with each other across a divide. Furthermore, that comprehension was never attained in actual life. Carroll never gave him a name. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not even casually. He let the stillness do the talking for him. And maybe he kept his dignity in the process. Maybe he was aware that some tales are best kept untold. He once shared the spotlight with someone who helped create one of the most memorable spectacles ever produced, and that person is the one Carroll O'Connor will never forgive. Nevertheless, there was no final word, no closure, and no handshake when the lights went down. Only distance. Simply be silent. The best stories are sometimes the ones that leave us wondering rather than the ones that are fully told.